especially when you create work and the mirror is in the work, is that for me, the mirror is constantly changing, but a book is a static object. And I think the way that people interpret you, sometimes they really want to see you a particular way and limit your mirror, so to speak. Whereas I'm constantly growing, I'm constantly evolving. So to give you a more specific example, when I came out as trans, it was about 10 years ago, and I did it on social media. I said I'm using she and her pronouns, and immediately people, that's all I said, trans, she, her pronouns. But immediately, you know, trans woman, my friends were calling me auntie, grandma, mom, like very gendered terms. And you have to remember 10 years ago, even the phrase non-binary wasn't as common as it is now. And the more that I have grown into my trans identity, the more I feel like maybe non-binary makes more sense for me. But because I'm in relationship with a public, it's more difficult to change your identity, because once you're locked in, people are like, transgender woman, this is who you are. And there's no room for you to grow beyond that, because that is the limitation of how people see you. I feel like with young people, they understand it. With young people, the beautiful thing, I follow a lot of young people on social media, and you'll see the way that you change your gender all the time. One day you present one way, one day you present another way. Like that, to me, I really identify with. But it's more older people, we still are so attached to boxes and labels. And it's really hard when you're also an author. People are really, you said this in this particular book, this is who you are. And I was like, yes, I said this 5 years ago, but now I'm working on something else and I'm changing, and I want to have room to grow and change. So do you know what I did? I wrote a book called People Change. Because I was like, okay, I have to, like, how do I make this point come across? And it's all about like the beauty of reinvention, and not just queer people. I think all of us should have room to grow and explore and evolve and change and be many people in one lifetime.
Thank you, Vivek. Yeah, I think it was Susan Sontag who said she never read anything that she wrote over 10 years ago, you know, because it was like,
yeah, that's
no
not who you are
you know?
anymore. Exactly. Exactly.
Wonderful. Let's continue a little bit, Vivek, with what you mentioned a little bit about transit, or or bodies in transit, which is sort of is also part of the talk, the topic of the topic of our talk today. So both of you question the forms in which we're named and classified, and the takeaway today is gender jail. You know, the gender jail is going to stay with me as a term. So you both question that in terms of language. So at which point did you realize that your bodies were not fixed, but fluid or transit, or your bodies? At what point, if there was a point, that you wanted to move away from the fixity and into the fluidity, or into the transition, or the transit?
Shall I go first, this one?
And yes, and Vivek, if you could also, Belle, add the component of translation, that you also translate between languages. The idea of transit, just explore the idea of transit, and when that began for you, that became a part of your work.
I mean, for me, I find jealousy a really good indicator. And I had a friend who told me they were coming out as trans, and I remember feeling so jealous, because I had this idea that a trans identity, or an identity that wasn't fixed, was something you had to explore before you were 25, kind of like ecstasy. If you hadn't done ecstasy by 25, then you'd like miss the boat, you know? And so, but then one of my friends came out as trans, and I remember just being like, having so much jealousy. And again, I think jealousy can be such an interesting teacher. We often put jealousy away. We tell ourselves jealousy is a bad thing. But I have actually learned a lot from when I feel jealous. And I think that was the moment where I was like, maybe there's something about what my friend is experiencing and communicating that I relate to. So for me, I think that I have always tried to push against gender norms and norms in general, but I didn't have the courage and the confidence to actually really follow through until I was about 35.
Thank you, Vivek.
Yeah.
Belle?
I think a lot of trans people have a narrative of trans childhood, and that is also mediated. There's a very interesting article by Dean Spade, who's also like an amazing author. I really recommend you to read his work. And he talks about how, in this is an academic paper that is not literary in that way, but he talks about how there's a narrative that you have to follow as a trans person to get to certain areas of trans care. So if you want access to
Wrong
hormones,
body.
yeah, exactly, right. So I have never felt that there was anything wrong with my body. Like, I've been very comfortable. I have explored also, I've written a lot about the body as a place of violence, but also as a place of recovery and pleasure and sharing and happiness and joy, right? So a lot of my writing has to do with violence, but also joy, and trying to reclaim your body as a place for joy, right? So I didn't fit in that narrative
Same,
that
yeah.
is asked from us. Like, it's like you're not really trans if you didn't know this when you were 2, right? And that's societal, but also from the medic institutions, right? And if you want access to certain things, you have to say certain things, so you're going to say them. So you're reinforcing the narrative, right? But I didn't have that, but I remember getting my haircut when I was little, and I have talked about this with other trans mask friends, and a lot of us have this experience of, for some reason, we have our haircut when we were little, and all of a sudden people are calling you a boy, and you feel like, I am not a boy, but also this feels kind of good. And for me, it was more like, I'm tricking the system. So I would say that very early, tricking, not so much being seen as a boy as such, but more like, I'm tricking the system. This person doesn't know what I am, and I love that, right? And not because I felt that I was a girl or that I was a boy, it was more like, everybody thinks that I am a girl, and this person doesn't know that that's what everybody thinks, and it felt very, very, very good. It felt very good. I was like 10 or something at the time, right? So I was not even thinking about my gender identity, or that was not something that I was aware of the fact that I could explore, right? So I would say that for me, it's not so much like the body as a wrong place, but the body as a place that I can take for myself, and that I can work with for myself, and that I can experiment for myself. And coming as a very outspoken feminist author in my country, in Catalonia, and being kind of like, I don't know, a feminist, I don't want to make this very big, but like, I don't know, I was like a representative of feminism, let's say, in my country of my time, right? Maybe 10 years ago. And everybody had me like in this little box of like, the woman who's a feminist, who hates men, whatever. It's like, I never hated men, I hate stupid people, like, and people who are obnoxious, and a lot of them happen to be men, but that's like a coincidence. It's not, I have nothing against men per se, like only if they are not being reasonable people, right? So they had me in that little box, and when I started experimenting with my gender, and particularly when I came out as non-binary a few years ago, I made like a public statement on the Catalan radio and everything. I started receiving a lot of online violence, like unprecedented. And it was very weird because some of it were like the obnoxious people being obnoxious people on the internet, which, you know, you expect. But some of it came also from feminist areas in like, you are deserting our gender. You're looking for privilege. And it's like, I mean, have you considered the fact that non-binary people are like extremely non-privileged in lots of ways? And this is something that I'm doing probably because it feels good to do this, to allow myself the freedom to do this, feels very good. Also because I really believe that if, I really believe of gender expectations as a prison, right? So I'm breaking out of this prison. And there was a lot of, I don't know, my friends have been telling me, yeah, people are talking about how you're using hormones, how you're doing these changes, how whatever, and they are like not understanding, why cannot you be happy with your body? I'm extremely happy with my body. And when women take estrogen or progesterone for years, for decades, not to get pregnant, with all of the very, not super cute, com es diu, efectes secundaris?
Side effects.
Side effects, with the extremely bad side effects for like depression, lower libido. Nobody questions that that's something that you are allowed to do as a woman. And then I start taking testosterone because I want to experiment how that feels. And it feels extremely good. Also, I'm going through perimenopause. I don't have the symptoms that my friends have who are not on testosterone. So it's like, for me, everything is an advantage. I'm feeling extremely good in my body in lots of ways, and I'm not deserting anything. I'm just doing whatever I want to do with my body, which is like what everybody should be doing. And I am not judging anybody who is not doing it, or who, like, I'm just doing what I have to do, right? So I feel that the expectation of gender and the thing of this is what you are and how dare you get out of here, well, I am doing this, and in doing this, maybe it makes you feel uncomfortable because you're not daring to do that, or because, I don't know, it makes you question your position in the world. And I think that's a good thing. Also, don't get mad at me, get mad at the system, right?
Yes,
Like,
exactly.
Exactly. Let's move a little bit to the different cultural traditions that you both come from, because this is also this talk is also thought about a dialogue between Canada and Spain, or Canada and Catalonia. And so I'd like Vivek and Belle to tell us a little bit about the language that you come from, in the sense that in these dialogues, I'm myself from Quebec, so Quebec and Catalonia were very similar, and I say more than Canada, but Quebec is in Canada, but, and the wonderful thing about Canada is that we have, if we separate, we wouldn't have Vivek, so, but anyway, I'd like you both to tell us a little bit about your linguistic background, your cultural background, and how that informs your work and your identity, and wherever the direction you want to take it.
So the thing is, I come from Catalonia. We have gone through a very intense political fight for independence from Spain. And we are losing at the time. We have been losing for centuries in this fight against Spain. We were not as lucky as Mexico and other countries. Also in a privileged position, being in Europe and like lots of other things, right? But we do have that fight, right? So I was born in Catalonia from Spanish parents. So in my household, the language that was spoken was Spanish. My family is from the south of Spain. But I very quickly adopted Catalan as my language. And I feel like I was assigned Spanish at birth, but no, this is not working, I'm just gonna speak Catalan, and I write in Catalan. And also, again, for me, and actually, I would say for any writer, writing in Catalan is a political statement. You cannot write in Catalan just because it's your language. When you are writing in Catalan, that means something. In the same way that being queer is a political statement. It's not the same as being, cis-passing or whatever, right? So there's like something that you're doing because that's something that you need to do, because that's something that feels true to you, because that's something that feels powerful to you. And at the same time, you're making your life very hard in lots of ways, and making everything about your life political, talking about your partner, talking about your life choices, talking about whatever, right? So I feel like for me, there's a connection between my linguistic identity and my gender identity that is going in ways that are not the ways that were expected from me, that are not the ways that were bestowed upon me, let's say, by the system. And also in my experience of migration, I left Catalonia for Chicago 3 years ago, and in the experience of being othered from another perspective as well. And anyone who has a Spanish accent when they speak English in Chicago, we are all Mexicans, because that's like the main population of Spanish-speaking people in Chicago, right? There's a high percentage. So all of a sudden, losing my white privilege, I had grown with white privilege my whole life. Losing that has been very instructive in lots of ways. And like losing my cisgender privilege has been useful to me in lots of ways. And I wish everybody could lose those privileges, and maybe that would eliminate them, maybe, potentially at some time. So I feel that there's a connection there between the linguistic identity and the gender identity when you are thinking about minorized spaces. And also, again, if we think of like the gender jail and the language jail, when you choose, okay, language, Catalan is my language, I'm going to write in Catalan, this is what I'm doing. If I now wanted, I don't know, because I have a very emotionally supportive network who's Spanish speaking in Chicago, if I wanted to write in Spanish, that would create like, I don't know if havoc, but I would be very criticized back home if I decided to write in Spanish, for instance, right? Which is not something that I'm saying that I want to do, but if I wanted to do that, this wouldn't be, again, seen as a, I don't know, just as a choice as a writer. I know more languages, I can use them, and why not use them? So that would be, that would be a problem, and that would be political, right? And I feel that playing with gender, again, for some people is easy to understand when you transition in the binary. And as you were saying, when you are not transitioning in the binary and you want to play with your expression and you want to wear earrings today and maybe not tomorrow, that's something that's not, because people like static, people like, this is who you are, I have an idea about you and I don't want to change my idea about you. So if you change, you're a traitor somehow. So don't be a traitor, like stay in your identity. And yeah, that's something that is not super interesting to me.
Thank you, Bill. Vivek?
I mean, you've asked a really big question, and I have a very complicated relationship to my culture as someone who was born in Canada, raised by immigrant parents from India, in a Hindu household, I think for me, one of the first things is I was really, really lucky with the kind of Hinduism I was raised in, which was very non-denominational. So the idea is that like all religions are one, but also, this is an illustration for my book, and I don't know if you can see from afar, but this is what one of the Hindu gods looks like, which is like literally a deity where half the body is male and half the body is quote unquote female. And so this is something that I had access to as a young person that immediately I connected to as, you know, a latent queer, gender nonconforming kid. So this is the kind of thing I like to explore in my work, or at least in my early work. It was really important for me to talk about Hinduism in my writing because there is this idea, a very Western idea, that queerness and faith can't coexist. So if you have religion and if you're queer, those things don't go together. But I was actually really fortunate that growing up in a religious household actually in a lot of ways gave my parents ways to see me. As you know, we were talking about this yesterday, but like many Hindu gods, the male gods, they have long hair, they, you know, have rosy cheeks, they like to do things that we see as feminine, so in North America. And so my parents were able to see me in a particular way because of my religion. But the older I've gotten, the more complicated it's become, because the more I've learned about Hinduism, the more I've learned about Hindu nationalism in India, and the way that Hindu nationalism is deeply rooted in Islamophobia. And so I've had to rethink, how do I talk about the things that are important to me in my own culture while not you know, subscribing to or somehow supporting Islamophobia. The other thing that's challenging for me is like, what does it mean for me to write about my Indian culture as someone who grew up in Canada? There's this thing that people can do, especially as immigrants or second generation, where we romanticize the homeland, but we don't actually know anything about the people there or the life there. We've never lived there. And so again, I've had to be a little bit more nuanced in how I write about my culture. The other layer that sadly came into my 30s, and I'm, you know, it's not that I wasn't aware, but I had to think differently about racism when it started to become very, very apparent during Black Lives Matter that my experience of being a racialized person in Canada is not the same as being Black, is not the same as being Indigenous, and I live in a country as a settler, essentially. So as someone who had been so, especially in my early work, so rooted in like, I'm brown, I've experienced racism, I write about Hinduism, I have had to really change what does it mean to write about my culture and these identities that matter so much to me, while also understanding that I'm also complicit in systems that harm other identities and experiences.
Thank you, Vivek. I'm just going to ask you to do a little education.
Sorry.
Sorry, what?
Oh, I know you told me to use smaller words.
Oh, no. This is perfect. And I think everyone's transfixed by what you're saying. And that's why I'm going to ask you, because we're in a very indigenous country, Mexico,
right,
as is Canada, except that people don't think of Canada as an indigenous country. Vivek, if you could educate the audience a little bit, because I'm sure most people here don't know that Canada is an indigenous country or an occupied, like what you mean by settler.
Yeah, so I mean, Canada, like the US, was colonized by white people, essentially. And so for me, a lot of my learning had to rethink what does it mean to be on land that is essentially stolen. My parents, I've been so attached to this idea, my parents are immigrants, they fought to come here, they've struggled so hard, but the thing is the land actually was taken from Indigenous people in Canada, and we have this romantic idea of Canada, I think, of like, especially in the US, I find anytime there's something bad in the politics, it's like, let's go to Canada, and it's like, no. Our country also has a history of blood, and it's ongoing, right? That's the other thing, is when we think about colonial violence, we think it's something that happened in the past, but there are literally like dozens of Indigenous communities in Canada where they don't have access to like drinking water, and that's like happening in real time in Canada, right? So again, as someone who, so much of my identity has been about talking about racism, I've had to think about, well, what privileges I've had, and it's very strange to suddenly think as a brown person I actually have privilege, and a lot of that learning has come through amazing Indigenous and Black activists in our country and beyond.
If I may, because I think there's an interesting connection in that in Catalonia there's a certain homo-nationalism as well, and feeling like Catalonia is more advanced, is more progressive, it's more open
Exactly.
to ideas than other parts of Spain or whatever, and there's this tension, and then going to Chicago again, and again, losing my white privilege, but being European and coming from technically Spain, let's say, right? A lot of Catalan people feel like separating themselves from the Spanish. We were not colonialists, we were not whatever, we didn't exercise that kind of violence, and they are erasing the colonial past of Catalonia, and we literally have art routes in Catalonia, where you can go visit the houses that were built by enslavists, by Catalan families who owned slaves, who exploited the lands in the Americas, and who brought back home a lot of richness, right? So whenever I say this in Catalonia, I have been told off in public television for saying this, that no, like the Catalans, we cannot separate ourselves from colonialism, we cannot think of ourselves as we are better because we're not Spanish, we didn't do all of this violence, because one, we did, and two, we benefited. Like, we can fight for independence as much as we like, and I am a big fighter for Catalan independence for a lot of reasons, but I am not going to deny that Catalonia is a rich country because of colonialism, and that is something that we need to acknowledge, right?
Thank you, Belle. God, I have so many questions, and there's so much that you opened, but I'm like, we could have an entire conversation about this. Let's just move a little bit now, talking about young people and creating community through the written word. Both of your professors or teach at universities also, that you both have students. And so working with the youth, sometimes that youth feel solitude or loneliness or confusion regarding their identity. So what role could literature, reading and writing, and your own work as artists, what does it do for you to help construct or build community and a sense of sharing as artists in terms of building community?
Oh, you go, please.
And please elaborate, because you both do many, many things for the next student.
I mean, I think we all here are probably lovers of literature and books, but I will say, just to give a personal anecdote, I don't think I read a book by an LGBTQ2S+ author until I was in my 20s, to my knowledge. And I remember the first time I read this book, it was called Stone Butch Blues. I don't know how many of you have heard of this book, by Leslie Feinberg. And I was like that awful person on the plane that was like weeping. Like, I had the book in front of me and I was like, just like crying, because it was the first time I'd read something where I felt seen in a particular way, or that it was like the person had written the story from my brain, except the person's very different from me. They grew up in the US, they're white, like it was very different. And it was reading that book that then made me want to write my own story. And so I think that, we're so lucky to live in a time where there's lots more representation in TV show and media. In fact, Canada, just everyone on Twitter is talking about the new gay hockey TV show. But there's nothing, as someone who teaches literature as well, like there's something about a book and getting into the mind of a character and the empathy that you can build. I read this beautiful book this year called Stolen Focus, and it's about how we're all on our phones all the time and we can't focus on anything. And it said the cure to our attention deficit is actually reading fiction, because by reading fiction, and I'm paraphrasing really poorly, but by reading fiction, we can empathize with other people. And fiction is one of the only ways to do that, is it builds empathy. And I really think this is especially true for characters or books that are about to us LGBTQ+ people, and that's why I'm such an advocate for books by and about queer and trans people.
And you also work as an editor, in a sense.
Yeah,
you also have
exactly.
the possibility to curate, and be that mediator also of content.
Exactly. Thank you.
Vivek. And Belle, I just want to quickly ask one question, because I was told we have 5 minutes, but not according to my clock, and I also wanted to make sure that, because I'm very good with timing. And then question, do we have time for questions? ¿Tenemos tiempo para preguntas?
I would love the questions.
I know, por eso, si no, no me hubiera extendido. ¿Sí? ¿Tenemos tiempo para preguntas? Okay, so Belle, you finish, and then this answer, and then questions from the public.
I think because my answer is so similar to yours.
Yeah, sure.
So we'll just go to the
We'll just
questions.
go to
I think it's
questions.
more
A ver,
interesting,
entonces questions from
Then
the
you can
audience.
take the first.
Levanten la mano, preguntas, no sean tímidos o tímidas o tímides. Levanten la mano, por favor. Aquí, allá.
Gracias. Hace tiempo en Jalapa, Veracruz, había una exposición de artes sobre la violencia estética. Y bueno, había muchas preguntas, aseveraciones sobre la violencia estética, y participaron allí algunos, o algunos, como se llama ahora, personas de la comunidad. Y bueno, hablaban sobre la discriminación. Y yo les comentaba que los seres humanos somos los únicos animales que buscamos que nos den aceptación, ¿no? O sea, si vemos en la naturaleza solamente es, ¿no? No necesita ser validada. Y desgraciadamente los seres humanos necesitamos ser validados. Mi pregunta es, con ustedes, ¿qué tan asertivo creen que uno tenga que buscar como sociedad, como personas, validación, y no solamente debemos ser y ya?
No solamente debemos ser qué, perdón. No solamente debemos ser qué, la última palabra no la oí.
Sí, o sea, que como deberíamos solamente ser personas y ya, sin buscar validación, así es simple.
Well, first I want to acknowledge, lo voy a decir en español, así todo el mundo me entiende directamente. Sabemos que en los turnos de palabras hay una cuestión de género, que es que a las chicas les cuesta más preguntar, les cuesta más lanzarse, y a la gente joven, por supuesto, le cuesta más. Entonces vamos a responder esta primera pregunta de esta persona que es más mayor, tiene más experiencia y tiene más seguridad, pero luego me encantaría que, como es el espacio para los jóvenes, pues que por favor que os animéis con toda la confianza, os vamos a recibir con mucho cariño y os vamos a responder con todo el respeto que merecéis. Y después de haber dicho esto, I would say that it's very easy, and for me, I would say the ultimate goal is that your gender doesn't matter any more than whether you like strawberry ice cream or chocolate ice cream, and all ice creams are equally good except for vanilla, which is disgusting. But I would say that's like the ultimate goal. But before we get there, I am not attached to labels because of any sense of personal identity. I don't see my identity as something that is personal. I see my identity as something that is relational, and I cannot unlabel myself because I suffer violences because of the identities that other people impose on me, right? Yes, exactly. So obviously, I agree, it would be great if we could all just be people. For that to happen, structural violence needs to stop. And the only way to stop structural violence is to create networks of alliance. And one way of creating networks of alliance is by these labels that we can, have a love and hate relationship with them, and we can claim them at the same time that we would like for them to disappear, right? So yeah, it's great, the discourse of I don't see color. Well, we do see color, and that plays a role in how we connect with other people, and we do see gender, and that plays a role with how we connect with other people, right? So for me, yeah, I wish we could all be just people. And we are in lots of ways. Also, we are not in lots of ways. And what you were saying, right, in growing up in Canada means something, growing up in Catalonia means another thing, and growing up in Mexico means something else, right? And looking a certain way means certain things, and looking other ways means other things, right? So we cannot pretend that that is not a thing, and I can say, and I can even feel it in my heart that we are all people. Also, I have grown learning in a homophobic, transphobic, racist, colonialist environment, and that is inside of me, and I need to do some work to readjust myself, to think about other people in other terms, and labels are things that can help me think deeper about certain things, right? That makes sense.
Do you want to add anything to that? No, it's fine. Perfect. Otra pregunta, pero chicos, a ver. Bueno.
Hola. Ay, bueno.
Hola.
¿Se escucha? Sí, ya. Yo soy maestra, los chicos que están aquí al frente son mi grupo. ¿Qué consejo podrían darles a los chicos? Trabajo particularmente en una escuela habitada por hombres y es difícil bajar los temas o abordar temas sobre género, ¿no? Sobre todo porque tienen como esta exigencia de performar una masculinidad hegemónica. Entonces, ¿cuál sería el consejo para que los chicos o la juventud, ¿no? Los chicos más jóvenes que nosotros, puedan intentar salirse de esa caja, ¿no? O de esa etiqueta? Porque sigue estando muy marcado, sobre todo en México y Latinoamérica, las etiquetas de lo masculino, sobre todo en temas de violencia y por temas del narcotráfico, ¿no? Entonces sigue habiendo como esta imposición a lo masculino, a lo fuerte, a la violencia, ¿no? A la discriminación, y hay una... Entonces, ¿cuál sería el consejo para poder que los chicos se sientan más libres de poder generar otras identidades, ¿no? También alrededor de eso? Gracias.
I mean, I don't know if this is the right answer for you. And so maybe I'll just answer quickly and then you can also pipe in. But I feel like the best thing I did in school was surround myself with girls, surrounding myself by women, getting the support, and like also having teachers who could support me. So anytime I encountered any kind of bullying, I made sure I was connected to teachers who could support me. But the most beautiful things in the world I've learned through being around like women and girls. And so like that's what I did as a way to push against the box that I was in. But I'll stop there, I don't know.
I would say, and this probably comes from my experience of having sons in particular, that boys experience a lot of violence whenever they deviate. And growing up as a little girl, I had a lot of freedom to be very butch, and I didn't suffer as much violence as my, other students in my class who were growing up as little boys and were deviating from this hegemonic masculinity. So when we think about why are boys performing in this way, because they don't want to suffer violence. So I would say, don't be afraid of connecting, and surrounding yourself with girls is great. Also, why don't you look for connections with other boys who are not being violent to you, right? So make it uncomfortable to be violent to people. Instead of performing violence to fit in, what if you look around you and see who is being nice to me? Who are the people that are being nice to me? Who are the people who are supporting me? Who are the boys in my class that I can trust with a secret? Who are going to be there when I'm going through a very rough breakup? Who are the boys that are being nice to me, right? And maybe you want to be around those people. And I know it's very scary to stop doing something that is asked of you by your society, by your age group, by whatever, right? But maybe it's worth it. It's worth it to be scared but do it, or to be scared but look for alliances. And then now more like humorously, but also true, feminist boys have more success with girls. So if you want to have more girls who are interested in you, being a feminist is going to open that door for you. And my second son had an experience growing up in a very feminist household. When he was 12, 13, he started feeling the need to assert his masculinity in very hegemonic ways. Me being his parent, you know how that worked, right? That didn't work very well. And I let him explore whatever, okay, you do you. Don't be violent, but hegemonic masculinity, go for it. And then when he was 15, he realized that he had a lot of feminist knowledge, and that was opening a lot of doors for him in terms of girlfriends, right? Because all of the girls were like, oh, this boy can listen. Oh, this boy knows about whatever. This boy respects me as a person. So a lot of girls were interested in going out with him. And I'm talking about this very transactionally, and obviously it's more complex than that. But maybe if you are nicer to people, and they are going to be nicer to you as well, and they are going to be around, to want to be around you, right? So that will give you an advantage.
Can I just add really quickly? I'd also say, as someone who did experience a lot of violence, as someone who's raised male, I think that the hardest thing is making sure that the adults intervene. There's a lot of adults in the room that actually don't do anything, that don't step in when they see male violence happening, when bullying happens. And so making sure that teachers understand that there's a responsibility to intervene, and that where young boys learn who to be, how they are, not only just from their parents, but also from other male teachers and adults in the school. So making sure that all the teachers have received proper training around topics like gender and masculinity and femininity and all these sorts of things. So because that way there's a different kind of role model that can potentially exist for young boys in school.
Bueno, Vivek Bell, muchísimas gracias por estar aquí. Tengo que desafortunadamente concluir. Rapidito les invito a que sigan disfrutando la programación de la FIL Joven y de la FIL en general. Bell y Vivek tienen más eventos, así que fíjense en el programa. Hay libros ahora a la venta para firmar también, entonces vayan afuera para poder charlar con las autoras, los autores aquí. Bueno.